Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup for Wednesday, September 1st, 2021. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and over the next half hour, we're going to be taking a look at 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators this past week. For those of you not familiar with the Midweek Roundup, we take these 3 questions we cover each week from our newsletter that comes out on Mondays. That's called All the SMIE News Fit to Share. SMIE stands for Social Media and International Education. So we take 3 of those themes we see in those news stories and we go more in depth into those questions here on the Roundup on Wednesdays. If you'd like to subscribe, we always drop a link to the most recent edition of the newsletter in the comments section on the Facebook page, where those of you who are watching live or on repeat will be able to find that and go more in depth for those stories. But you can also go to smieconsulting.org/subscribe if you'd like to subscribe to the newsletter, get it in your inbox every Monday morning at 9 a.m. But for now, we'll go to the roundup here. I want to say thank you to those joining live here on Facebook. Obviously, those who can't make it live, watch on repeat or on our Facebook page or our YouTube channel, or those that download us each week as one of our audio-only podcast versions of the Roundup. So thank you for making us a part of your international education journey, and we hope we provide some useful content for you along the way. So today's 3 questions. First up, how have international enrollments been impacted by COVID-19? Second, is a joint statement on international education enough to spur action? And third, what will the UK do without EU students? We'll answer those 3 questions and more here on the Roundup today. First question, how have international enrollments been impacted by COVID-19? This is coming primarily from a report from IC3 movement and IIE. We are all familiar with IIE, with Open Doors and their work in Project Atlas with global student mobility. IC3 movement started in India as a kind of a group of universities and those interested in India, but has grown throughout the region in South and East Asia, but has worldwide membership now. This joint report considers, and this is from a PI News article, considers how global student mobility flows in major world regions have been impacted by the pandemic. And its conclusions show that there are issues related to visas and vaccines, and travel restrictions. Certainly public health policies in certain countries have had a significant negative impact on enrollments, international enrollments that had been traditional strengths. This is for those who have been watching the Roundup or have been involved in international ed for more than a minute in the last year and a half. Certainly this is not coming as any shock to you. But what has happened is the findings, many countries who have experienced these drop-offs in new enrollments have certainly seen that greater majority of the students that had been enrolled decided to stay in country rather than take a risk and go home, meaning in many cases they've not been able to return home during the pandemic to visit family or care for loved ones. So that care for current international students has become the focus of these institutions that have relied on international students for so long. And there were really border closures, visas, vaccines still to this month remain clear barriers. We already know 3 of the top receiving countries, Australia, New Zealand, China, are still, in all intents and purposes, closed to new international enrollments. Even returning international students are not able to return in many cases. And that's having a long-term impact on the economies of those countries in negative ways, certainly. So what this IC3 IIE report certainly concludes are what we certainly know, that these are all linked. Vaccines are going to be one of the thresholds in Australia. They have to be at 70% before they think about reopening borders. In New Zealand, they're looking to get all their folks vaccinated yet, and surprisingly, In New Zealand, the vaccination rates are abysmally low for a country that has done so well in preventing huge swaths of cases and deaths as a result. They've been able to contain it fairly well. They've had some recent outbreaks in Auckland, but their vaccination rates are very low, and they haven't prioritized that. Same in Australia. They're working up towards that 70 by the end of the calendar year, 70%. So that's a real challenge, and that's preventing internal policies from changing in certain countries to allow international students to return in numbers for borders to be reopened. In other countries, that's the vaccination piece will impact quarantine requirements. In the UK, if you're not vaccinated, you certainly would have that quarantine responsibility for 10 to 14 days. In the US, it's recommended, if not required by the CDC, if you're not vaccinated to quarantine upon arrival. But there's really no tracking to make sure that works. It's really, and from the student perspective, it's going to be down to the individual institutions as to what those policies are. I've encouraged all my university that I'm working with, and encourage anyone watching who's on the university side. Have you been tracking your students, incoming students, and whether they've been able to secure vaccinations, and what are you doing on the back end for them if they haven't? Are you able to put in place some policies that will accommodate or allow them to get vaccinated upon arrival, take them to the CVS or the local drugstore, wherever they need to go to get those vaccinations? Is there going to be a clinic on campus? Some are able to do that, some aren't, depending on state regulations, if you're a state institution or not, and how friendly your state is to opening up those things, your campuses, to those types of activities. So the vaccination piece is critical. The visa pieces are critical in terms of access back into the country or to the country for the first time. We've been talking over the last several months, last year, we've been talking about how certainly last summer the real challenge was there weren't enough, or the overwhelming majority of U.S. consulates were still closed for business, and certainly for international students to get visas to come. There have been those that have been open for emergency use, emergency appointments. First story here that we'll share on the visa side is from the Times of India. It's ironically the Times of India having a story about U.S. visas issued to students in China. Since May, over 85,000 student visas have been issued. That's back up to pre-pandemic levels. So that's certainly encouraging news, seeing in our number one source country, seeing that. It's good, but it's not enough, because frankly, when you consider it, China has now had, this is the second year of Chinese students not being able, or intended Chinese students trying to get into the country. So in effect, we're back up pre-pandemic levels, or we're back up to pre-pandemic levels in terms of visa issuance, but we've now should have had 2 years of students that are trying to get visas to come this fall. So it seems like we've got a little bit more than a year, what a normal summer would take. And they're still processing visas. They've had some hiccups along the way, but they're plowing ahead. So, State Department has recognized in these countries that are so vital for international students coming to the United States, China, and we'll talk about India in a second too, that we need those students to have access to visa appointments. So in India and China, they've certainly reopened. In China as of May, in India as of June, after the first Delta wave passed there. They've been doing yeoman's work. And in India too, the next story is that in 2021, there's been a record number of student visas issued to Indians looking to come to the United States. So more than 55,000 student and exchange visitors have been or will have been issued this year already. So that's a record in India. So that's positive news. In China's positive news. But again, it should be records or close to record-setting numbers, considering the 2 years of students that are trying to enroll this fall. Those that couldn't get in last year and studied remotely, that are applying to come to the U.S. to continue their studies, and those that have applied new in this past year to begin their studies with us. So we'll see where that goes. And in India and China, those are the two that everybody talks about, and with good reason, because they account for nearly 50% of all international students in the United States. The real challenge is for the rest of the world. And here's where we do get into some interesting territory. Just saw an article this morning was referenced in the NAFSA forums from Cato Institute that says, as of August 20th, just seeing this article this week, 62% of U.S. consulates were fully or partially closed in August. So that's a little bit disconcerting. We had seen a good number, or even the majority, were partially operating for emergency use, so emergency appointments only for students. That's still happening. We are seeing that for initial student visas, the State Department has not yet made commitments to make it easier and to allow a virtual interview rather than the traditional in-person interview. They've done that for students who are applying for visa renewals, but they're not doing that they're waiving the interview requirement for visa renewals, but not for new visas. So this is something that this is something that's troubling in terms of what the future might be, and a lot of it's down to local circumstances in terms of pandemic. We talked last week about the staffing at embassies and consulates. They're only able to do that based on the revenue generated from DS-160 fees, the application for non-immigrant visas that all students fill out. That obviously from the last fiscal year, revenue was down close to 90 to 100% in some cases for non-immigrant visa revenue. So that's determining staffing for this year. And obviously there's been prioritization for key sending markets, Brazil, China, and India. We've seen that happen, but that's not a global thing yet. We still see a number of consulates and embassies still closed because they don't have the staff to fully operate and to do visa appointments on a regular basis. So certainly many miles to go before we sleep on that one. So there's visas and vaccines and border closures, travel restrictions are still going to impact us for this fall here in the U.S., but in other countries as well. And we'll talk more about those implications in the weeks and months to come. Now let's shift gears to our second question, and this is in reference to the joint statement that came out at the end of July at the EdUSA Forum. There's been a lot written about this since, and I'll chip in this week with one of my own pieces on this thought. And the question is a joint statement on international education enough to spur action? Now, if for those who've been following my blog series on through IDP Connect on the 6 Ps of strategic international enrollment management, we finished that series last month with peers, and we've talked about that at length here on the Roundup. But after the EdUSA Forum, I asked my colleagues, do you mind if I do this, kind of get my thoughts out about this new joint statement in support of international education and what that might lead to. I call it in my article that I'm referencing today for IDP Connect, a unicorn sighting in DC, because it is something that is extremely rare, a mythical beast, if you will, that the U.S. Could potentially be moving towards coordinated government-level international education policy for the country. And that is something that anyone in international education in the States has been calling for as soon as they got into the profession and understood the wider implications of the lack of government influence on education policy in the United States after the high school level. And this is something that we all know, I've talked about it before here on the Roundup, that there are 3, potentially 4 major government departments that impact international education in different ways. Department of Education very mildly impacts it, other than some minor Fulbright scholarship money that they have. They don't really impact federal U.S. colleges and universities because of that accreditation and approval process, other than the financial aid piece, is handled through regional accreditors and national accreditors for programs. But you have Department of Homeland Security that has control over the border and immigration benefits for non-immigrants and immigrants that come to the U.S. after they arrive. You have Department of Commerce that is their angle, and so DHS more concerned with security and implementation of benefits to monitoring as well. You have Department of Commerce that's main goal is promoting U.S. interests abroad, U.S. businesses, and one of those most significant pieces is international education, the higher ed sector, and other levels of the U.S. economy that are involved in international education. Their focus is more money, business focus, and then you have Department of State. That is very much in the public diplomacy mold that they see the bringing in students and scholars from overseas helps create mutual understanding between the U.S. and other countries around the world, and that those that study here and go home take what they know, take what they've learned about the United States, and become leaders in their countries and hopefully better friends to the United States in the future. So that foreign students today, world leaders tomorrow, that's been a consistent theme of how the State Department talks about international education as a value. And then so those four departments, State, Commerce, DHS, and Education, all have some piece of the pie in terms of how they can potentially influence government policy. But they don't always communicate, and they often are working at cross purposes. So the joint statement is a way to help rally that support in one area that shows for the first time that they're all on the same page. There's a lot of, as we've talked about, there's been a lot of priorities that have been established in that seek to provide some kind of structure moving forward. There's call for, from the NAFSA side and some of the higher ed folks, there's been calls for a unified approach or a White House level appointment or office to coordinate amongst those four departments as well as with the private sector and public universities, with the association world that has some sort of say as to how the policies are implemented and what policies need to be considered. So there's a lot to this to make it work in the United States, and it will take a lot of willpower, frankly, and a lot of political capital to make it happen, I think. One of my colleagues who works, one of my best friends, has worked for the State Department for over 23 years now, and he has shared with me on several occasions, particularly as of late with this current administration, they are big idea people. They like to put out these big ideas fairly regularly and have been doing so since they took office. The challenge is the implementation piece. They have the great ideas, but do they put those ideas and create a structure that allows those ideas to actually flourish? So there's a lot of miles to go. So I can't say I'm overly optimistic that this is going to happen, but it's certainly, if followed through on, is an absolute watershed moment for the United States that I certainly support with all I have, and will do so as long as I can. But what we see what I do appreciate with what the policy or this joint statement does at least set the framework for are some conversations that acknowledge that in the U.S.'s position in the world, particularly in relation to international student mobility, isn't as strong as it used to be. That it recognizes that in the acknowledgement of where we are at this time is that the U.S. is losing ground to our competitors around the world. And if you remember back to my 6P series, that's the first P, perspective. Having that perspective as you kind of sets the framework for how you approach what you're going to do. And in this case, it's talking about having the right perspective on, we are in a competition for students around the world, and our policies in many cases are counterproductive and prohibit free flowing of students and ideas that we can only benefit from as a nation. So talks about in this joint statement about where the challenges are. There's a number of articles, and whenever you have all higher ed publications and some business ones as well getting on the same page in support of this, you know something's going on. So it's certainly a long time coming. We've seen. The last time we saw anything even resembling a move towards an international ed policy was in April of 2000, when President Clinton at the time directed Vice President Gore to kind of take the lead in coordinating a policy for international education. And that, with his defeat in the election that year and then 9/11 shortly after that, any thoughts of that policy dream of being implemented died with it. In terms of what next steps are out there, certainly the association world has been very front and center in terms of talking about what that might look like and the prioritization of certain things, of getting rid of some of those Trump-era policies that were very much counterproductive towards a joint international education policy, talking about improving processing times within USCIS within DHS, to have a much friendlier customer service focus, to talk about preserving OPT in legal battles, getting rid of that proposal to eliminate DS from duration of status from visa statuses for international students. So there's a lot more. But if this does happen, as I say in my article, it would be the most significant step forward for the United States as a benefit and a promotional tool for the United States since OPT was extended to 3 years for STEM OPT back in 2008 at the end of the Bush administration. So it will be a bigger game changer than that, frankly, in terms of setting the stage for the U.S. to begin attracting a wider range of students in more significant numbers and streamlining processes, talking about dual intent for student visa status that would eliminate the 214B denials that we often see for international students. So some really solid things that can come out of this, and I addressed some of that in my article as to what you might want to consider. And that is followed up by this past week. We saw the international or the IEP world, intensive English programs, get together in their association with English USA, as well as you see NAFSA, TESOL, International Association, and UC IEP, the Consortium of University and College Intensive English Programs, and support from ASSET and CEA. The two accrediting bodies for English language programs have all submitted a joint letter, much like ACE and other association worlds did right after the joint statement was issued. The joint statement on principles is supported obviously by the IEP world. They've taken huge hits during the pandemic, so we'll see where that one goes as well. But there's a lot of movement towards this. So we'll certainly keeping our fingers on this one, because there's a lot of movement now, I think, towards making this happen. And if leadership within the White House gets on board with this and forms that kind of a White House level organization or structure to facilitate some of the changes that need to be made, then we'll see real change happen. So we're ways away from that happening, but certainly it's a great first step, and certainly one that we need to support and do everything we can to make happen in the United States for sure. Now, last question of the day. What will the UK do without EU students? And this is a pretty significant piece. This has all been coming, frankly, since Brexit vote was made in 2019. We've seen the result, or 2017, excuse me. We've seen this coming down the pike in terms of what EU students had benefited from, kind of in the U.S. terms, in-state tuition status. But that's gone away now with Brexit. And individual campuses who have relied on EU students coming to them have had to either come up with their own scholarship schemes to work on partnership programs, 2+2 kind of programs, or 1+2 or 2+1. There's been a lot of focus on kind of figuring out what EU relationships are going to look like for British universities. Unfortunately, it hasn't really happened to the extent that it needed to. There wasn't enough prep time on the university level to really make it happen. So what we're seeing with the UK, we've seen basically the applications kind of drop off the cliff this year in terms of EU students. And the numbers show, I think, a 56% plunge in EU students accepted at British universities for this fall. So that was, there was a 43% drop in applications from the EU, but a 56% drop in those that have students that were placed. So that is down from 22,430 last year to just 9,820 this year. So pretty precipitous. Now, what that means is they have to now pay the equivalent of pay up front the tuition dollars. The 12,300 is the average fee, UK university tuition fee. Pay that up front. And this has particularly been an impact in areas of Europe that perhaps aren't as wealthy as those in the western part of the continent. So we saw for one university, Coventry, they had invested heavily in Eastern Europe in recent years, Hungary and Romania in particular. They are saying they're losing 80% of its European recruitment because most of their EU students have come from Eastern Europe. So some significant damage to UK universities. And before this year, European students as a whole were the largest single group of students represented at UK universities. They're going to be overtaken by Chinese students this fall that were already the largest single country, but now would be the largest group, including those that we're talking about here today. With regard to EU students as a continent represented at British universities. So the knock-on effect of this has been on UK research, that because of the fees that UK universities have lost because these EU students, there was already a drop last year, but we're now seeing this coming fall is going to be an even more significant drop. You're seeing those drops in funding that used to fund research activity at British universities, there's going to be some significant shortfalls. So there are knock-on effects here for UK unis in terms of what they're going to be able to do on the research side. So everything's interconnected in higher ed here. We certainly need to take that into consideration as we make our decisions. And certainly UK universities that are needing a better way to engage with Europe now. So those traditional exchanges or degree-seeking students aren't happening. So UK universities either are having to invest in significant scholarships, or they're going to have to rely more on partnership developments. And some of the lesser-known institutions are really having to work hard to make those partnerships happen, whether with individual governments in certain countries that they've targeted, or with particular universities as they look to expand their footprint across the European continent. So a lot to keep a focus on for UK universities this fall. Certainly they're going to see increases in Chinese and Indian students, which seems to be a theme running through for many of destination countries this year. But certainly we'll see what the longer term implications are related to EU students going to the UK. So that's all we have for you this week on the Roundup. Look forward to chatting with you again next Wednesday on September 8th. Just a quick note for those who are also subscribers to the newsletter. We won't be doing a newsletter on Labor Day this coming week, but we'll do a roundup on select stories that we're finding of interest for further explanation here on the Roundup next week. So until then, we wish you all a very happy Labor Day weekend and enjoy the time off with family. Have a great day. Cheers.